Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. 8 years ago, the American people were promised that Guantanamo would be closed. That has not yet happened. The reasons given by the Obama administration have been many. Yet in all of this debate, the focus is always abstract. Guantanamo as a place, as a piece of government real estate. Almost nowhere is the debate about what's going on there now, what's happened there, and what's been done there in the name of security and of the American people. If you listen to the political debate today, you'll hear none of this. But you will hear it today from my guest, Jeffrey Kaye. Jeffrey Kaye is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley. He's a clinical psychologist here in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's taught adult development and history and systems of psychology to graduate students. And for 10 years, he worked part-time with Survivors International, conducting both assessments and psychotherapy. It is my pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Kaye here to talk about his book, Cover Up at Guantanamo, the NCIS investigation into the suicide of Mohammed el-Hanafi and Abdul Rahman al-Amri. Jeffrey Kaye, thanks so much for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'm really happy to be here.
It's a delight to have you here. First of all, talk a little bit about your own personal interest and your own personal understanding of Guantanamo and what's been going on there. How did you come to this?
Well, I came to this, you mentioned that I worked for Survivors International, and I do talk a little bit about this in the book. And it is a life-changing event to sit down with a torture survivor and interview them about what they went through, which was, in essence, my job, one way or another to do. And it's life-changing because it is amazing the degree in which the inhumanity of various governmental systems, that includes the United States, can take and objectify human beings and try to break them. And what makes the United States' efforts to do this so unique is they try to do this by so-called scientific means. So they include doctors and psychologists, and they study these things, and they do experiments upon these things. And I'm a psychologist, and I came to it later in life, and to be a psychologist and a healer was an important part of my identity. And here I was, face-to-face, as the scandal leaked out not long around the time of the lead-up to the Iraq War and just afterwards, and of course Abu Ghraib, that the United States itself was heavily involved in torture, and that psychologists were involved in creating the programs for that torture, and also in doing the torture or advising the torturers. And so that presented an ethical dilemma to me and to others in my field, by the way, that one could just sit by and do nothing, or one could bear witness and try and either stop this terrible things from happening, or to at least notify the public and make, a mark in history so that people would know that these terrible events were taking place. And that's what I've done, and that's really what this book is about.
I want to talk also about the other side of the ethics in all of this, and that is the ethics and the reconciliation of those in the medical community, those that take an oath to do no harm, be they in the mental health field or be they regular doctors, that are part and parcel of what's been going on with respect to torture and in places like Guantanamo.
Well, there are a number of different responses. The primary response is to numb oneself to it, to feel helpless in the face of it, or to turn away from it. And in the book, in fact, I try to explain how psychologically this happens, because it's really quite horrific, and people really do not want to look upon such horrible things. And particularly, the closer it is, the more you might want to look away. Now, there's the people, of course, who involve themselves, and I haven't talked to many of them. They don't really want to talk to me. But to the degree I've read about them, had some encounters with them briefly, and have read the disputes that go on behind the scenes between the fight over psychological ethics, for instance, in the American Psychological Association, exactly on these issues. what you find is that these people, set up another way of dealing with it is a rationalization is put forward that these things are important, that they're doing good for the country, they're fighting terrorism. They put forth the ticking bomb scenario. We must sometimes do these things. And then there's the John Yoo defense, which is a kind of a pettifogging, legalistic defense, which says, well, we're really not torturing here, you see, because, the U.S. government's own attorneys say this isn't torture, so it's not torture. So there's a number of different responses to this.
One of the things you talk about is really the nature of the torture itself. We're used to hearing a lot about waterboarding, but you talk about it in a much more medicalized and much more scientific way in terms of what's been done, what's been undertaken, and the uses of various drugs in this process. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, and the CIA studied ways to break down individuals, what we would say, of course, called torture, for literally decades. That was part of their MK Ultra program. They wrote a manual of interrogation and torture, which you can find online, called the QBARC manual. In fact, today the most recent and most open version of that from the CIA that we've gotten via Freedom of Information Act was one that I obtained recently, which brought out even more information about how that manual, or what's in that manual. But yeah, the waterboarding, is horrific as it is, perhaps only took place in a handful of individuals. In other words, the government says only 3. It certainly was at least twice that. And then there were various forms of water torture that come very close to what waterboarding was, that took place on dozens of detainees, a number including at Guantanamo. But the kinds of torture that the government came up with follows a formula they themselves called DDD. That's 3 Ds, like dog, dog, dog. But the D stand for dependency, debility, which means weakness, and dread. And that's their formula. And they use it even today in Guantanamo. The United Nations recently called out the United States for some of the techniques they still use in their Army Field Manual. And these techniques are based on things such as sleep deprivation, the isolation of individuals from other people, sensory deprivation, the isolation of people from stimuli, perceptual organization, and sometimes sensory overload, and sometimes the use of drugs. And in fact, in the book, Cover Up in Guantanamo, I talk about the bizarre but true, strange use of anti-malarial drugs, not to prevent malaria, but for the terrible side effects they cause of disorientation, dizziness, and even sometimes psychosis and hallucinations on some people to disorient them. It too, drugs were used to break down individuals. In the death of Abdul Rahman Al-Amri, his autopsy report specifically says in its toxicology section that they tested specifically for the drug mefloquine, which is a very controversial drug. Many of your listeners maybe know it as Lariam, which the United States Department of Defense is now essentially ordered to stop being given to U.S. soldiers because of the terrible side effects and even deaths that have occurred from this drug. It tends to drive people to suicide, for instance, and some people, not everyone. So there's clear evidence that these drugs were used, and the bottom line of it all is that they weren't used really to get information, but to manipulate, and with their own language, to exploit prisoners, detainees, for their own purposes. Now, sometimes that might be information. Sometimes it would be to turn them and make them, stool pigeons, squealers against their compatriots, sometimes for false confessions, sometimes for show trials. This is how it has been used by other governments, and it's also how torture of this type is used by the United States government.
What, if anything, was going on in terms of monitoring all of this? Was there any central record-keeping, central effort on the part of the government to keep track of all of this?
Well, there's a lot of controversy over that, and how you would even make sense of that information. Now, certainly the intelligence agencies involved, for instance, the Defense Intelligence Agency or the Central Intelligence Agency, they, kept records of what they were of so-called intelligence of the interrogations that were taken. But I don't know. None of us know, and we can only surmise what types of records were kept of the kind of experimental approaches that they were taking to, the responses of detainees to these approaches. But one really public example did come out and was published by Time magazine. It was the interrogation logs of the detainee known as 063, also known as Al-Qahtani. And they were published in Time magazine. You can read them online. People can Google them. And what it was a record of his responses to the various types of interventions, right? Let's see how he responds when we wake him up from after 10 minutes sleep. Let's see how he responds if there are barking dogs on him, right? Let's see how he responds if we pour water over his head, which they did. And they weren't keeping records of what he said. In other words, this is not an interrogation log. This is a log of his behavioral responses to torture interventions. And I suspect there must be many, many, many more logs like this. There were also videotapes taken, many, many hours of videotapes. And of course, quite famously, it was the destruction of such videotapes by the CIA that apparently spurred the Senate Intelligence Committee's recent investigation into the CIA torture program that was in the news in the past few years. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the ways they kept track of what they were doing.
What was the Detainee Information Management System?
The Detainee Information Management System was a computerized system that was mandatory for use at Guantanamo and still is. It was there it was implemented after the first few years at Guantanamo, after the initial controversies over prisoner abuse came out. The Pentagon instituted this system, which kind of similar to, in some ways, putting videotapes on cops because they're shooting people. They thought, we're going to log everything that happens, every moment. If a detainee wants to lead a prayer, we're going to log it. If a detainee cries, we're going to log it. If we have to make a detainee, this is literally in their manual, kneel down so we can put the shackles on them, we're going to put down how they kneeled and if there was any deviation. In other words, every single fact about detainee life and how they were treated by the guards or medical personnel were to be recorded in this detainee information management system. Head counts every hour. It's of who was on the prison cells, etc. And the reason, if you bring this up, and I make a huge thing of it in the book, is that in almost every case in which I looked in any depth of the detainee deaths that took place at Guantanamo, in each case, these computer logs were manipulated, and in one case, they were literally shut down, which goes totally against standard operating procedure, so that they could alter or affect, in essence, the historical record, the factual record of what was happening. So the very safety, it was meant to be a safety device so that we'd know, that could prove that abuse wasn't taking place. But what we see is every time there's the potential of serious misconduct, such as death or possibly murder taking place, that system was manipulated or shut down. And after I applied my Freedom of Information Act request on the death of one of the detainees, the main one I talk about in the book, Muhammad al-Hanafi, the logs from that system literally disappeared after for 2 days, a crucial 2 days, the day the detainee died and the following day, disappeared from the record entirely. They were, quote, missing. So it's an incredibly important computer system. It says it's what Guantanamo people, the authorities themselves rely on to understand exactly what's happening. And my point in the book is to show one of the primary evidence of cover-up here is the manipulation of that system. And it was, in the case of al-Hanafi, the charge was that it was shut down itself by NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the very agency that was supposed to be investigating the deaths, ordered immediately after al-Hanafi's death that the system be shut down and nothing further recorded in it, which is quite amazing. And then they did their own investigation of themselves as to what happened, an investigation which ultimately went nowhere.
To what extent do we know that any of these activities were taking place in other places and at other sites outside of Guantanamo?
Sure. Well, we know that from the statements of other prisoners who had been held at places like Bagram, or certainly in the CIA black sites, or we know it from the leaked report of the International Committee on the Red Cross on prisoners that they saw at in the CIA black sites, but also their leaked report over 10 years ago on abuse that was taking place, of course, in Guantanamo. We have, evidence from other journalists, Jeremy Scahill, who reported on prisoner abuse taking place in CIA-run, although staffed by local people, prisons in Somalia, in their war on terror that the U.S. is leading there. So, how much we know about all of these things, of course, is, I have not myself made an encyclopedic study of all the different sites, but there have been many reports by Amnesty International, reports by the Open Society Foundations. We basically know from the work of different NGOs, journalists, and the statements of former prisoners themselves.
Talk a little bit about these two suicides and what happened.
Well, the earlier suicide that I'm discussing in the book was that of a man by the name of Abdul Rahman al-Amri. He was a Saudi Arabian, a bit older than many of the other detainees in that he was in his 30s. He had been in the Saudi Arabian military. He'd been trained, in fact, by the Americans in the use of anti-tank weaponry and, I assume, other military matters. He had, by apparently his own account, been addicted to drugs, or a heavy drug user who then had a kind of a religious awakening in terms of Islam. And he went to Afghanistan to fight for jihad, which meant at that time to fight for the Taliban against, in the civil wars that were happening within Afghanistan at the time, and got swept up when people were being arrested after 9/11, after the CIA and special forces went in, and was sent to Guantanamo. And there apparently he was cooperative, according to some accounts, with the Americans. In fact, warned the Americans, according to an Associated Press account, that people were planning suicides and were getting desperate inside Guantanamo, and that they should watch out for that. He also, though, was a hunger striker as well. In his, we have records of his weight changes, and they gyrated fantastically, almost unbelievably. You could gain or lose 25 to 50 pounds in a month. And this went up and down like a yo-yo. This was the same for the other detainee I studied as well. And in 2007, on May 30th, 2007, he was reportedly found dead in his cell. The story goes that he hanged himself by tearing strips from his bed sheet and fashioning a rope from it that he then tied to the air grating in his room and put around his neck and hanged himself until he was dead. He also somehow did all of this, while being under near constant surveillance at a minimum, so far as I can tell, of being looked in upon every 3 minutes in his cell. Oh, and by the way, he also somehow found time to tear off a strip of his bedding and tie his hands behind his back, if you believe the government authorities. All of that sounds very suspicious to me and quite remarkable. What made it even further suspicious when I got the documents from the Freedom of Information Act is I discovered there was yet another piece of sheet that he supposedly fashioned that was subsequently thrown out, possibly in the medical trash, which means once he was brought to the hospital outside of his cell, And we don't know exactly what that other piece of torn sheet was used for, but I speculate that it was used as a gag or used for a procedure known as dry boarding, which Professor Almerindo Ojeda at the University of Davis has documented occurred with other detainees, which is a form essentially of suffocating people to make them talk, although if you do it too much, they might actually kill them. Whether that's exactly what happened to Al-Amri, I don't know, but that is reportedly also what happened to 3 detainees who died, who were found almost exactly like Al-Amri in their cells, hanged with their hands bound, although in front of them, not behind. They also had some kind of mask on their face, which Al-Amri, so far as I know, did not. But like Al-Amri, they too were tested for the presence of certain anti-malarial drugs, chloroquine, and in one case, mefloquine, just as Al-Amri was tested for. The circumstances are so similar that I have to wonder, and I don't know what was happening, what that was all about. We think it was Joe Hickman, who did a book on this. He was a former guard at Guantanamo, said it was due to experiments that were happening, and that he himself had witnessed what was most likely these 3 detainees in 2006 sent to a CIA black site on Guantanamo and then brought back later that night. So he's one of the detainees that I write about, and there are a lot of questions about his death. The bed sheet that supposedly he used to fashion a rope, according to other accounts, that would have been impossible because after the deaths in 2006, the bed sheets were changed to a type that could not be torn or ripped and or cut, and then also were taken away every day rather, from the detainees and only given back at night, a time for them to go to sleep. So he had very little time. And he was discovered during the day, a time when there should have been no sheep there. There's so many questions and so many implausibilities that the story of his death really makes no sense, and it raises a host of questions, all of which have been almost, except for maybe the first months after he died in 2007, have just essentially disappeared off the public radar entirely.
And the death of Hanafi?
Hanafi was a younger man. He was only about 23 years old or so when he was captured in Afghanistan and also sent to pretty much directly to Guantanamo. He had been part of doing, he was fighting with other foreign fighters for the Taliban and had been taken prisoner by the Northern Alliance, which was people they were fighting in the civil wars in Afghanistan, and according to certain accounts, was even some kind of a leader, or took a leadership position in trying to negotiate for the freedom of these prisoners at the time. He was also supposedly, he was present, and how involved we don't know. He says he never shot anybody in a prison uprising that took place in Afghanistan. And the WikiLeaks WikiLeaks released a number of documents people might know about the detainees that apparently came from Guantanamo, and they wanted to exploit al-Hanafi's understandings of what happened at that prison uprising and whether he was a leader of some sort, in their interrogations. But Hanafi very quickly became, quite mentally ill and went in and out of the mental ward at Guantanamo, the Behavioral Health Unit, the BHU, which is the acronym used for short. And he made numerous suicide attempts within a few years that he was there. He entered in 2002. He died in June 1st, 2009. And in the weeks leading up to his death, he had made approximately 4 to 5, depending on what account you want to believe, suicide attempts, including one horrific one in which he ran and tried to crack his head open by running straight into a metal bolt that was on a fence in the recreation yard. And when that didn't work, he tried to strangle himself to death with a T-shirt. And he made other attempts as well. And he was in the behavioral health unit. And at the day that he died, he was interviewed by both the commander of the camp and the chief psychologist. The commander of the camp apparently came to see Hanafi because to explain that they were changing the rules inside the behavioral health unit in the hospital itself, that the hospital would have no special privileges anymore, that from now on they would be run according to the other rules of the camp. And the rules of the camp in Guantanamo were quite harsh indeed. You know, everything from every piece of toilet paper to, the food you ate, to everything was controlled, monitored, used as a reward or a punishment. That included, of course, rules that had you sent from cell to cell to cell on a so that you could never settle down and even make your tiny little cell any kind of home. And Hanafi went, he left a suicide note, and I reprint the note in the book. And by the way, all the documents I got can be viewed online at GuantanamoTruth.com for your listeners out there, including the suicide note of Hanafi, and where he describes the final thing that happened that led him to decide there was, as he put it, no solution but death. And that was that he went to the psychologist, it was the chief psychologist, and to ask him for help, that he felt he was being tortured in the camp, and that he needed help, and that these new rules were too much to bear. And when he said he was being tortured, well, we also have the testimony not just of Hanafi, but of the chief psychologist himself. He said, when he or any other detainee, because apparently there were others, came to him or to any staff and came to him rather and said, "There's torture going on," I just turn on my heel and walk away. He would not even engage them on the issue. Well, when this happened to Hanafi that day, he was shocked. He shocked in a way in which the hopelessness and suicidality he had was apparently redoubled. And he said, "I now know there's no solution but death for me." And in fact, later that day, he died. But the means of that death also call out a lot of questions. In the book, my hypothesis is that unlike the death of Al-Amri and the 2006 detainees, I think that it's very possible Hanafi was not per se the subject of an experiment outside of how you consider the torture, and the whole camp itself is a huge experiment. But in the sense that he was given the materials, or backs were turned at the right time, or machines shut down, and allowed to kill himself. He was already quite suicidal. And he was found in his cell. Supposedly, the mode of suicide was that he had ripped part of his underwear, the elastic band around your briefs. Many men, I'm sure, wear cotton briefs out there who are listening. They know what I'm talking about. And he wrapped it around his neck and supposedly twisted it until it was so tight he strangled himself to death. Not an easy thing to do, by the way. But that's what they said he did. But of course, what makes this, number one, suspicious from the get-go is, once again, he's being monitored near constantly in the cell. And number two, the type of underwear that he supposedly was able to fashion, a ligature, they call it, the thing you put around his neck to kill himself, was not the type of underwear that prisoners were distributed in Guantanamo. In fact, again, after the 2006 suicides, they were supposedly so freaked out that there would be more suicides. They made sure that the only kind of underwear that detainees had, brief-type underwear, weren't cotton briefs, but a very flimsy boxer type of underwear that apparently couldn't sustain any weight or any ripping or anything like that. Just really, really shoddy underwear, one that would fall apart if stretched. And so that's strange. So there's much more I could go on with your listeners, but there's a lot of, that's who Hanafi was and how he died.
Real quickly, why was Hanafi there? How did he wind up in Guantanamo?
He was picked up, he was a prisoner in the, had been fighting with the Taliban, and he had been captured at a battle that took place in Afghanistan, and he was one of a number of prisoners who had been captured at this battle and brought to a prison there. And again, there was a prison riot, and after this riot was put down, prison riot, by the way, were the very first Americans died. It was Mike Spann, a CIA contract agent, and he was captured there, sent to a hospital because he had been wounded in that prisoner uprising, and then sent from there to Guantanamo.
To what extent is any of this activity, the kind of things you've been talking about, to what extent is it going on today?
Well, of course, there are still prisoners at Guantanamo, and there are prisoners in other war on terror sites that the United States government runs. We don't know them all. I mean, the secrecy, is still quite tight, and many of these prisons now are just run by U.S. client states. And prisoners are held there. An example at the time of al-Hanashi's death was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who supposedly had given the information about Iraq's use of weapons of mass destruction to the Americans that Powell used at the UN to justify the invasion of Iraq. But he was imprisoned at Guantanamo, but later, we don't know when, he was sent to Libya, and that's where he was held until he supposedly committed suicide, right a month or so, or a little less, before the death of al-Hanashi. But he was in a Libyan prison. And so we know that Obama has been slowly, very slowly, emptying or transferring prisoners out of Guantanamo. But there are still, I don't know the exact figure today, 60-something prisoners, I believe, still in Guantanamo, a dozen or so of whom are these high-value detainees held in a special camp just for them, Camp 7, supposedly to go on trial for military commissions. But how much do we know? I think we can assume there are still prisons. Obama never shut down the rendition program that the CIA had, or that George Bush rather had, although he claims that they don't rendition to torture anymore. So we know there are indications, there have been stories written, but the full extent of it is still kept secret. The government is extremely secretive about what they do. Jeffrey
Kaye, the book is Cover Up at Guantanamo. Jeffrey, I thank you so much for spending time with us on Who, What, Why today.
Thank you very much. I was glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.